You good, Alan? I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, giving me the opportunity. And I'm a little bit like Scott talked this morning. I've got to get my bifocals in the right place here. I've got a few years on this, but before I get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about a guy that I used to work with, and I haven't dealt with him in several years, but a situation came up and I had to deal with him, and that brought back lots of memories. When I used to work with this guy almost, every week. And back when I started in the business that I'm in, the company's philosophy was hire young, dumb guys with warm boots, and they would kind of mentor you with an older guy that had been around. And one of the mentors that I had, his name was Jack Dietz. And Jack Dietz was a Flatlander, so that was against him to start with. And he was born in Kansas, lived in Oklahoma, and I didn't think much of Flatlanders. And he was, I thought, really ancient. He was probably 45 when I was 20. And he was very opinionated, very crusty, and very crude. And in the piece of equipment that Jack specialized in, he was probably also, if not the leading authority in the world. He was in the top 3 in it. So Jack was one of these kind of guys you could go out in the mud with you and talk, and he could sit in front of a whole, room full of PhDs, and he would talk the way I was here. And there's 2 stories I always like to tell about Jack Dietz, and one of those is going to be the basis of my talk tonight. But the first one, to kind of give you an idea of how Jack was, we were doing a job in Vanward, Ohio, and it was in January, and it was about 20 below zero that night. The wind was howling, it was really cold. This piece of equipment, there's a regulator on, it's very important, and the vent started to get steam blown out of it. So the customer calls me, say 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So I called Dietz. Back then, you didn't have the convenience of cell phones. So we would carry, like a portable phone, like the phone company used, we'd drag cable out of the building. So, I get Jack out of bed. What do you want? I said, the vent hole. And what am I supposed to do with this aiming plan? And Jack starts talking. And he's using 47-syllable words that I don't even know what they mean. And finally I said, Jack, it's really dark and it's really cold out here. Oh, well, just plug holes. And it'll be fine. Don't bother me anymore. I mean, that was kind of the way Jack was. I thought, well, you could have told me that 30 minutes ago, and I wouldn't be blue. But, and it's amazing, as I got older, Jack got a lot smarter. He's probably in his 90s now. He's going blind, but we still use him as a consultant. His mind is destroyed fresh. But we were at the dinner one night, and this conversation came up, and Jack was telling us about his neighbor. And I don't think Jack and the neighbor got along very well, but Jack had bought a new wheelbarrow. And it wasn't just a regular wheelbarrow. It was like when they first came out with dual wheels, and it had a lot of capacity. It was super heavy duty. And like all things Jack, he was very proud of his wheelbarrow, and he told everyone about it. And he said, but I got this neighbor. And he said, he's constantly coming over here and borrowing my stuff. And Jack said, I got this new wheelbarrow, and he said, I haven't even hardly got the paint wore off of it, and it spends more time with the neighbors. So Jack finally decides that he's going to make a decision to stop this problem. So the neighbor, sure enough, comes across, wants to borrow the wheelbarrow, and Jack said, I can't let you have it. The neighbor says, well, why? I've always borrowed it before. Jack said, my wife needs it to make the bed. And the neighbor said, but Jack, your wife does not need that wheelbarrow to make the bed. But Jack said, you don't understand. When you're looking for an excuse, one's as good as enough. Okay? So I never forgot that for some reason. But I thought that would be a good topic maybe to talk about, is decisions and excuses. If we're going to talk about stuff, words are important. So, I always like, if we're going to use the word excuse, I'd like to go to the Webster's Dictionary and just read you a couple of descriptions of what that word really means. And one of them that they have is to apologize or give reason for. And another description of that word is to over-release from an obligation, and another description of that word is to justify. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. And then you kind of talk about decisions. Jack made that decision, to put a stop to his neighbor's bar in Wilbury. Decision can be defined as the act of deciding or settling a dispute or question, the act of making up one's mind, a judgment or conclusion, a determination, or a firmness of mind. Okay, so there's kind of a couple of words we want to talk about. And I think they're important words. I think they're important things because every day we probably make excuses and decisions in our lives. My boys came in and said, "We're going to sit in on your talk, Dad." And I said, "That's great because I can talk about you. I was going to talk about them anyway." But my 3 sons have a genetic problem. And they got it naturally because their mother and I had it. And that's that we're night people. Gail and I, even though we'd have to get up early, we were always sleep deprived because we just didn't get our wind going until about 8 in the evening. Sometimes it'd be 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, then we had kids and that complicated things. So we decided that we would raise our kids, and break this habit of, really kind of starting their day at 8 o'clock in the evening. And that was pretty easy when they were little. Kate was the oldest, so we would put Kate in his room at what we thought was an appropriate bedtime, 8 o'clock, and he'd rattle the baby bed and scream until he went to bed, and we just ignore him, and he got to learn to go to bed early. We kind of repeated the process with Will and Zane, but as they got older, this genetic defect has reared its ugly head. And if you want to talk about excuses, that's a good place to start, because they know that, they get home from school and they have things they need to do, they have chores, and, if they need to do their homework, and they need to work on their activities, at bedtime is X. As they got older, it stretched out, but it's, say, 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock rolls around, you guys need to go to bed. Well, Dad, we have to groom the dog. Or, we've got to listen to the rest of this, music CD. Or, one night it was, Pawn Stars is having a marathon, Dad. And we might have to do a report next year at school. And I haven't written them all down, but there's countless excuses. And I always think back to Jack Dietz and Will, one is as good as another. And the one I like is, "We're going to bed, Dad." And then, you wander back in there about 11:30 and there's still light on in their room. Well, we went to sleep, but we woke back. We went to sleep and we woke back up. What happened? Broke the thing. So, I get to hear a lot of excuses. And I work in the public. So, I get used to hearing excuses. Our proposal group at work, one of the worst. Customer says, "I need a quote done, I need it done by the 30th of January. And on the 29th, they call and say, "We haven't started on that yet. But here's what we can tell them." So, one excuse, it's as good as another. But those excuses have consequences. And those consequences can lead to bad things. I was telling Sam this morning, if you weren't here Wednesday night and you missed Sam's talk about stress, it was great. But Sam mentioned his buddy. And his buddy was talking to Sam, "You're going to come to a ball game tomorrow night." So Wednesday night, Sam said, "No, I can't do that. I have to go to church." And Sam said, "I don't know when my friend, who's a good Christian man, made that first excuse that he missed church to go to a ball game." And I asked him this morning, I said, "We'll talk about your buddy." I said, and Sam said, "I went later after church Wednesday night again, he was there." But I said, at some point, that guy made a decision to make an excuse. And I'm glad Sam, makes the decision so he doesn't have to make an excuse. He's here where he's supposed to be. Things like that can lead to decisions that aren't necessarily good. And, You ask Chris, why are you going to talk about this? Well, if you think about it, the Bible, from beginning to end, is full of excuses and decisions. I told Gary Conner, you don't have to go very far. Look at Genesis 3, the fall of man. Everybody knows that story. God's walking through the garden. Comes up, where are you at, Adam? Well, I'm hiding. Why are you hiding, Adam? Well, because I'm naked and I'm afraid. God said, did you eat of the tree I told you not to? The woman made me do it. Okay? That's pretty early in the book. First excuse. You don't have to go very much further. You can go to Exodus. Moses. We talked about Moses a little bit this morning. Great man of God. He gets called face to face with God at the burning bush. God says, hey, I got this mission for you, Moses. I want you to go out. I want you to free the children of Israel. What's one of Moses' first things that he says? Does anybody know the excuse he used?
Can't speak.
Can't speak. And, the nice thing about when you're trying to put an excuse out to God, he really does listen to your excuses. He has an answer. Because God immediately said, well, okay, we'll let Aaron talk. You handle the stick, Aaron will handle the talking. But there again, this is very early in the Bible. You go a little bit further, you have the children of Israel. In Numbers, chapters 13 and 14, you can read about the children of Israel. They're out in the wilderness, and I always think of the children of Israel as a coaster ride. They had highs and they had lows. It was all like this all the time. They would sin and do something bad, and God would forgive them and be back on a high. But when we get to this point, they go to Moses and they say, look, this was a bad move. We should go back. They probably had all kinds of excuses. The Bible doesn't say exactly what they were. They were unhappy. And the result of those excuses was the decision that God made. He told his people, this whole generation is not going to get to go into the promised land. So the results of those excuses that led to the decision that they didn't get the promises that they wanted. And until that whole generation was gone, children of Israel didn't move into the promised land. And these excuses that are throughout the Bible, really don't have any border with different people. Saul one day, Saul was the first king, and he had problems. And when he came up against the Philistines and Goliath, I don't know that he made excuses, but they sure didn't move forward. They're afraid of Goliath. So God intervened, and he sent David. And what was Paul's excuse to David? Does anybody know that? 1 Samuel 17. He said, you're just a mere child. Well, David quickly showed him that a mere child with faith that had made a decision to do what God told him to, took care of the situation. And I know Linda came home to me a little bit ago. I had a talk several years ago on change. And I used the same scripture you used this morning, Scott. And she signed that right in my Bible. I said, yeah, I did too. So I said, I was familiar with it. But I did another talk just not too long after that, 1 Samuel 11:1. And in that talk, it was the time of the year that the kings went to war and David stayed home. We talked about what happened when David stayed home. Now, I don't know what kind of excuse David had when he didn't go to war as expected. But it led him into all kinds of problems. That's when the situation with Bathsheba came up. He made arrangements to kill her husband. And, when you talk about mighty men of God in the Bible, when you talk about Moses and David, these aren't lightweights. These are heavyweights. But for some reason, they made an excuse for a bad decision, backed up with an excuse, and it cost them to do that. So, so they're very, probably some thought needs to be put in when we use an excuse for a decision. There's a lot more examples in the Bible. The scripture I'd like to look at the book of Luke, chapter 14, and we'll talk about verses 15 through 24. And just a little background on these verses. Jesus has been sitting down to dinner with some of the church dignitaries. And they've been talking about some things. And when we get to verse 15, Jesus tells a parable. And it's the parable of the Great Supper. And now when one of those who sat at the table with him, him being Jesus, heard these things, he said unto him, Blessed is he who eats the bread in the kingdom of heaven. And I look at that statement as, one of those gentlemen sitting at that table with Jesus, he was kind of reflecting on what it would be like to sit at God's table. Okay? And it's at this point that Jesus decides to tell them a parable. And then he, and that's Jesus, said unto him, A certain man gave a great supper and invited many, and sent his servant at supper time to say to those who were invited, Come, for all things are now ready. But they all, with one accord, began to make excuse. The first said to him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must go and see it. And I ask you to have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, I'm going to test them. I ask you to have me excused. Still another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So that servant came and reported these things to his master. And then the master of the house, being angry, said unto his servant, Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, bring in all the poor and the lame and the blind. And the servant said, Master, it is done as you commanded, and there is still room. Then the master said to the servant, Go into the highway and the hedges, and compel them to come in, to my house, that my house may be filled. For I say unto you that none of those men who were invited shall taste my supper. Now, there's things that in that story that you probably need to know. In verse 17, when the master sent his servant out, it was a custom at that time that you were going to have a supper or a feast or a banquet, that you'd announce it way in advance. But the actual day of the event, you would send your servant out to your invited guests and say, I'm ready. This is kind of the short notice, come in. Okay? And so, the work was prepared. The master had, went to whatever that work was, the cost and work to have this event, and he was ready for the people to come in. Okay? And we'll talk about that a little more, but at verse 18 we start to see the excuse thing come in. And are they much different than excuses we use today? I mean, one person said, well, I just bought some land and I need to go look at it or walk over it. I bought some property in my life a couple of times, and I sure didn't do it without going out and looking at it first and walking around. Second man had bought some yoke of oxen. I bought a lot of cattle in my life, but I've never bought one in the blind. I always go look at them. One guy get married, I'm not going to touch that. But I can think about Jack Dietz. When you're looking for an excuse, one's as good as another. If I walked around this church and said, do you have an excuse for not going to this dinner? I'm sure we could all come up with one that's current to our times. the result of some of those excuses was the master was mad. And he was angry. I can understand his anger. He's got this all ready. He put forth the effort. He'd invited these people. Would it have been any better if they'd have just said, we're not coming because, rather than an excuse? So what does he do in his anger? I think he redirects. You know, he tells his servant, all right, you know, we've been kind of stood up. We'll show them. I'm angry. Just got to get people off the street. We've got the food here. Why not, you know, share it? And that brings up another thing that in the custom at that time was if a Maine person, or maybe a person who had a little handicap, was it treated exactly like the mainstream in their religious ceremonies or these feasts and things. So I don't know that we call them second-class citizens, but that's kind of how they were treated. So what the master's saying now, these guys made these excuses. Now I've made a decision based on those excuses, and I'm going to just bring these second-class citizen guys in. Okay? So he did that. And what was funny was the servant did exactly as told him. He gathered up the ones that were close to second class and went back to his master and he said, look, you know, we still have room. What do you want to do now? And he said, fine. Go to the roads. Go to the outlying places. Find enough people. Fill this up. Let's proceed with that. Now, there's a lot of other things in that parable we could relate that to. You know, we could relate that to Jesus' gift being offered to the Gentiles and a lot of things. But you know, the point was that the master carried through with it. But on the very last, verse 24 is what I think is really important. This to the people that made the excuse, the master said, "For I say to you that none of these men who were invited shall taste of my supper." They made a decision not to go. They made an excuse. They kind of forfeited the right to go to that dinner. That could happen to us. I mean, how many people feel the nudging of the Holy Spirit to do something, and we make an excuse, and we don't make a decision, or we don't want to make a decision, so we make an excuse. And I believe God will work with us and work with us and work with us. But I believe there's a point where God moves on. And we may miss that opportunity. So it's, when we want to make an excuse about something, I think we should take it pretty serious. And it's easy. I like the messages Scott are talking about the average Christian, because I guess I consider myself an average Christian, and I fight with a lot of things. And it's very difficult sometimes to kind of get it all in. I catch myself I have a busy life. I have a farm and kids and a wife and a job and responsibilities and obligations at church. Very difficult. And I try not to make excuses. Sometimes I catch myself doing it. I have an excuse why I don't really read my Bible every day like I should. It's pretty easy to say, man, I'm tired. I've been up since 5 o'clock this morning. I want to go to bed. Or I got to get up at 3 o'clock because I have a business trip and I have to do it one day and I got to drive for 4 hours to get there. So it's easy to make excuses. But I know that I should really make the time to do that. Do we make excuses that we don't have time or the resources to spend time with God? I spend a lot of time with God in the shower and behind the steering wheel of my company pickup truck. Those are the two easiest places for me. And I try not to make excuses not to do that, but if you really should try to put some time together every day. Just if you start out with 5 minutes, try to spend some quiet time alone with just you and God. If you can't think of anything else, shower's a great place. Okay? Like I say, Chuck this morning when Scott was waving his arms and going down the interstate, well, I've been in those situations. Because like I say, I do a lot of talking to God when I'm driving up and down the highway. But nowadays it's okay because people think you're talking on your cell phone. So, do we make excuses for missing church? We have really, I like what Jeff said the first day of the New Year. He said we have 100% attendance at church. We really, Gail and I decided this year we're really going to make an effort to do that. Try to be here every time we can. Sometimes we can't. We have work obligations that we can't get out of. Sometimes our kids are in stuff that's required. The world doesn't look at Wednesday night or Sunday night sometimes the way we do. But, maybe we'd have some reasons once in a while, but we're going to try not to have any excuses. So it's easy to do that. Do we have excuses for not praying? We talked about prayer last Sunday morning. And, prayer's so simple. It's one of the most important things we can do, and it's the easiest thing we can do. You don't have to talk out loud. You can pray in your head. You don't have to have a special place. God gets it. You don't have to spend hours doing it. No special ceremony. It's simple. We should never, ever have an excuse not to pray about something. And, do we catch ourselves, coming up with an excuse not to pray? You kind of look at some of these areas I mentioned here, and it almost makes you wonder if there's not some areas in our lives that we need to make a decision to decide. I'm not trying to play with words. But, sometimes you have to say, okay, I'm going to make the decision and I'm going to do this. I'm going to decide to do this. I'm going to decide to spend 5 minutes starting out every morning and read my Bible for 5 minutes. See if I can do it for a week. Or I got to decide that I'm going to try my best to, be where I should be, which is in church, when the church is having services. Sometimes you have to make a decision to decide. We're bombarded with that, with media. You don't have to watch TV very long. They want you to decide to have a, better body or more muscles or more health. Now there's a thing, for brain games to make your brain better. You want your brain better? Spend a little time right here. You'll have a better brain, I'll guarantee you. So, sometimes we need to make a decision to decide. And although we make many decisions each day, there's one that's more important than all of them. And that's the one is that, we accept Christ and we try to live our lives the best we can to serve Him. And, I wonder sometimes how many people will spend eternity in hell regretting an excuse. And how many people will spend eternity in heaven, enjoying a decision. I mean, that's really important. And when you think about eternity, it's really pretty simple. It boils down to a couple of things. Number one thing you always want to remember is time's a one-way street. There's no do-overs. My kids will get in trouble, and they'll do something. I'll say, let's do a do-over, Dad. Well, we can do do-overs. There's no do-overs when we're talking about eternity. So you always want to keep, when you think about eternity and the excuses and decisions, that's something you want to put in the forefront. Time's a one-way street. There's no do-overs. And the second thing is pretty basic. Everybody's going to have eternity. And you have a choice where you want to spend that eternity. There's only two. And, we can either make an excuse or we can make a decision. And You know, if you haven't made that decision, do you need to? There's no guarantee you walk out that door right now tonight, it may be your last opportunity. And if you've made that decision, you know, the next thing you probably need to decide on is, do I want to live up to that commitment? I mean, salvation's the easy part. It's a free gift. You know, the work really starts after that's done, trying to live that out. And that's where the excuses start. And, you know, Jesus said, you know, let your answers be yes or no, be pretty plain. So, you know, that's one thing maybe we all need to look at when we think about an excuse. Maybe we ought to just say no, or yes, or, you know, whatever the basic question is. But it's an interesting topic. Like I said, it's all through the Bible. And, you know, like Jack Dietz, get smarter. You know, the more I look at things in the Bible, there's not any situations that it don't cover if you want to go find it and look at it. And, you know, that's another testimony of how great God is things like this, excuses. You know, something simple that'll come up, and it's covered in the book. You know, you might have to dig around for it, but it's in there. So, you know, as we want to move forward and do what's right, it's something we want to do is spend time looking for that. I guess if you turn to Romans 1:20, I'm just going to close, and you know, you hear the world have all kinds of excuses for, well, you know, is there a God? You know, that's always one. Or if it's a kind God, why do bad things happen? But and it's kind of excuses that you're using, but I always kind of like this passage, Romans 1:20. It says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." I never paid attention to the excuse until I got ready to do this talk. But, I mean, if you look, people amaze me. They say, how can there be a God? How can there not be? You look at, you know, simple things. The seasons. How, you know, we live on a farm. How agriculture works. The sun provides the energy force for our plants and the soil. There really can't be an excuse. And so, in closing, like I say, I hope you take a little bit of time to think about the deal about, you know, the two things of eternity, because that's the most important excuse or decision that you'll ever make.